The late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the torn earth of Leyte Island as Captain Takeo Nakamura crouched beside the smouldering wreckage of what had been his Type 97 Chiha medium tank just hours before. It was December 14th, 1944, and the humid Philippine air carried the acrid smell of burned metal and cordite. Around him, the remnants of the 4th Tank Regiment's 3rd Company lay scattered across the muddy plantation road, 5 tanks reduced to blackened steel in less than 20 minutes of combat. But what gnawed at Nakamura's mind as he watched American Sherman tanks rolling past his position wasn't the speed of his defeat. It was something far more disturbing that he had been noticing for months, something that contradicted everything he had been taught at the armored warfare school in Chiba. The Americans had already lost more tanks in this single campaign than Japan had built in the entire war. And yet, they kept coming. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. Nakamura had destroyed his first Sherman tank in the jungles of Luzon 3 months earlier, a clean hit from his 47mm main gun that had penetrated the side armor and set the American vehicle ablaze. His crew had celebrated, painting a small white star on the turret of their Chiha to mark the kill. Within a week, they had painted 3 more. Within a month, 7. By December, they had stopped counting. It didn't matter. For every Sherman they knocked out, 2 more appeared the next day, sometimes 3, sometimes 5. The Americans seemed to have an infinite supply. This was supposed to be impossible. Everything Nakamura had learned during his training in 1942 had emphasized that Japan's material disadvantage would be overcome by superior spirit, tactical excellence, and the fundamental weakness of American industrial capacity when faced with a 2-ocean war. The instructors at Chiba had been clear. American factories were designed for civilian automobiles, not military equipment. Their workers were undisciplined, their production lines inefficient, their national character too soft for the sustained industrial mobilization that total war demanded. Japan, by contrast, had been on a war footing since 1937. The empire's factories had been producing tanks, aircraft, and warships for 7 years by the time of Pearl Harbor. The Americans were playing catch-up, and catch-up took time they wouldn't have. The numbers had seemed to support this belief. In 1941, Japan's industrial output was formidable for an Asian power. The Mitsubishi Heavy Industries plant in Sagami had been producing tanks since 1935. The Osaka arsenal had decades of experience in military manufacturing. When Nakamura graduated from tank school in March of 1942, Japan had already built thousands of tanks. The instructors spoke confidently about Japanese production capacity, about the empire's ability to replace losses, about the strategic advantage of interior lines and established manufacturing infrastructure. But no one had told him about what America could actually do when it decided to build tanks. The pre-war assessment of American industrial capacity had been based on a fundamental misunderstanding of how modern mass production worked. Japanese military planners had studied American automobile manufacturing and concluded that while the United States could produce cars efficiently, military vehicles were different. Tanks required specialized steel, complex gearing systems, precise machining of armor plate, and sophisticated fire control mechanisms. These weren't things you could simply adapt from civilian production. Converting an automobile factory to tank production would take years, require complete retooling, and demand technical expertise that American workers, accustomed to repetitive assembly line tasks, simply didn't possess. This belief was reinforced by Japanese observations of American society in the 1930s. Military attachés in Washington had reported on labor strikes, unemployment, and industrial inefficiency. They noted that American workers changed jobs frequently, that labor unions disrupted production, that there was no national industrial mobilization plan. The American economy was built on consumer goods, refrigerators, radios, vacuum cleaners. How could a nation that specialized in comfort and convenience suddenly transform itself into an arsenal of democracy? It seemed absurd. The Japanese Army's calculations in 1941 had been methodical. They estimated that America might be able to produce perhaps 10,000 tanks over 4 years of total war if they fully mobilized their industrial capacity. This was an optimistic estimate from Japan's perspective, perhaps too optimistic. Even this number assumed perfect conditions: no strikes, no disruption of raw material supplies, complete conversion of civilian manufacturing, and technical breakthroughs in mass production techniques. The realistic estimate was lower, perhaps 7,000 to 8,000 tanks across the entire war. This was still more than Japan could produce, but not overwhelmingly so. Japan had begun the war with approximately 2,000 tanks in active service and projected it could build an additional 6,000 by 1945. The ratio would be unfavorable, perhaps 2 to 1, but manageable through superior tactics and defensive positioning. These calculations had one critical flaw: they were completely wrong. As Nakamura watched another column of Sherman tanks moving up the coastal road toward Ormoc, he tried to count them: 20, 30. He lost track. His company had destroyed perhaps 15 American tanks since landing on Leyte. Those 15 had been replaced within 48 hours. The American logistics system was something his training had never prepared him for. When a Sherman was knocked out, a recovery vehicle itself, a modified tank chassis, would tow it to a field repair depot where it would be cannibalized for parts or rebuilt entirely. When a Sherman was destroyed beyond repair, a new one would arrive on a Liberty ship from San Francisco. The whole process took days, sometimes hours. When a Japanese tank was destroyed, it stayed destroyed. The Type 97 Chiha that Nakamura had commanded was a decent tank by 1937 standards. It weighed 15 tons, had armor thickness of 25 millimeters on the front glacis, and mounted a short-barreled 47mm gun originally designed for infantry support. It could reach a top speed of 38 kilometers per hour on roads, though rough terrain reduced this to a crawl. The crew of 4 commander, gunner, driver, and hull machine gunner worked in cramped conditions, with minimal communication between positions. The tank had been designed to fight Chinese armor, which in the 1930s meant effectively unarmored trucks and improvised fighting vehicles. It had not been designed to fight Shermans. The M4A3 Sherman that had destroyed Nakamura's tank that afternoon was a completely different kind of machine. It weighed 30 tons, had frontal armor of 63 millimeters, and mounted a high-velocity 75 millimeter gun that could penetrate Japanese tank armor at ranges exceeding 1,000 meters. It had a 5-man crew with powered turret traverse, gyroscopic stabilization for the main gun, and radio communication between all vehicles in the platoon. Most importantly, it had been built in a factory that produced more tanks in a single month than Japan built in an entire year. The Chrysler Tank Arsenal in Detroit had begun production of Sherman tanks in April of 1942. By the end of that year, it was producing 500 M4A3 tanks every month. 500 tanks every month from a single factory. There were 11 factories producing Shermans. Nakamura didn't know these numbers yet. He wouldn't learn the full scope of American production until after the war, during his interrogation at the prisoner of war camp in Luzon. But he was beginning to suspect the truth. The evidence was all around him: fresh tanks with new paint, maintenance depots the size of small cities, supply dumps that seemed to stretch for kilometers, repair vehicles that could rebuild a Sherman's transmission in hours rather than weeks. This wasn't the industrial capacity of a nation struggling to convert civilian production to military use. This was something else entirely. The Americans weren't catching up. They had already lapped Japan before the race had barely begun. The reality of American tank production in World War II represents one of the most staggering industrial achievements in human history, and simultaneously, one of the most catastrophic intelligence failures in modern warfare. While Japanese military planners were estimating American output at 7,000 to 10,000 tanks across 4 years of war, the actual number was 88,410 tanks. Not 7,000, not 10,000, 88,410. This wasn't a miscalculation. It was a complete failure to understand what American industrial capitalism could accomplish when directed toward a single purpose. The numbers are almost difficult to comprehend in their scale. Between 1942 and 1945, the United States produced 49,234 Sherman tanks alone. That's one Sherman tank every 45 minutes, 24 hours a day, for 3.5 years. When you add the Stuart light tanks, the Chaffee light tanks, the Grant medium tanks, and various specialized variants, the total reaches 88,410 armored fighting vehicles. Japan, by contrast, produced approximately 6,450 tanks in the same period. The ratio wasn't 2-to-1 as Japanese planners had predicted. It wasn't even 10-to-1. It was nearly 14-to-1. To put this in perspective, American factories produced more tanks in the first 6 months of 1943 than Japan produced during the entire war. The Chrysler tank arsenal alone, a single facility in Detroit, produced more Sherman tanks than all of Japan's tank factories combined. The Fisher Body plant in Grand Blanc, Michigan, produced 75% as many tanks as the entire Empire of Japan. These weren't small differences. This was industrial capacity operating on a completely different scale of magnitude. The question that haunted Japanese officers after the war, the question that Captain Nakamura would struggle with during his years in the prisoner of war camp, was simple. How did we get it so wrong? The answer lay in a series of compounding errors in intelligence assessment, cultural assumptions, and a fundamental misunderstanding of American industrial organization. Japanese military attachés in the 1930s had observed American factories and concluded that mass production worked for simple consumer goods, but couldn't be applied to complex military equipment. They saw the Ford River Rouge plant producing thousands of identical Model A automobiles, and assumed this was the limit of American manufacturing sophistication. What they missed was that Henry Ford's assembly line wasn't just a method for making cars faster. It was a completely new philosophy of manufacturing that could be applied to anything. The American approach to tank production was revolutionary. Rather than building each tank as a semi-custom project with specialized craftsmen, American manufacturers broke down tank construction into thousands of standardized, interchangeable components that could be produced by semi-skilled workers using purpose-built tools and jigs. A Sherman tank contained approximately 8,000 individual parts. Each of these parts was manufactured to precise tolerances so that any Sherman transmission would fit any Sherman hull, any turret would mate with any chassis, any final drive would connect to any sprocket. This meant that parts could be manufactured in dozens of different factories, shipped to assembly plants, and put together by workers who had been trained for weeks rather than years. The Japanese approach to tank manufacturing was fundamentally different. At the Mitsubishi plant in Sagami, skilled craftsmen hand-fitted components to each individual tank. If a transmission didn't quite mate with the engine, a master mechanic would file down the mounting points until it fit. If armor plates didn't align properly, they were heated and hammered into position. Each tank was, in a sense, a unique creation. This produced excellent quality control and allowed for modifications and improvements to be incorporated quickly. But it was slow, terribly, catastrophically slow. The Mitsubishi Sagami plant could produce approximately 4 tanks per month at peak capacity. The Osaka arsenal managed about 6. Across all of Japan's tank production facilities, the maximum output achieved was approximately 140 tanks per month in 1944. This was considered an impressive achievement given Japan's limited raw material supplies and the competing demands of aircraft and naval production. The Chrysler Tank Arsenal produced 500 Sherman tanks per month, every month, starting in late 1942 and continuing through the end of the war. 500 tanks from one factory was more than all of Japan's factories could produce in 3.5 months. But numbers alone don't capture the psychological impact of this disparity. For Japanese tank crews in the field, the experience of fighting American armor wasn't just about facing superior equipment. It was about confronting evidence that everything they had been told about the war was fundamentally untrue. Every destroyed Sherman that was replaced within days was proof that the Empire's strategic calculations were wrong. Every supply dump filled with spare parts and replacement vehicles was evidence that American industrial capacity wasn't weak or inefficient or hampered by labor problems. Every time a Japanese tank company engaged American armor and destroyed more tanks than they lost, only to face twice as many Shermans the next day, the psychological toll accumulated. Lieutenant Hiroshi Yamada of the 7th Tank Regiment experienced this revelation in a particularly stark way during the Battle of the Philippine Sea in June of 1944. His unit had been positioned on Saipan as part of the island's defensive garrison. When American forces landed on June 15th, Yamada's company of 12 Type 95 Hargo light tanks was ordered to conduct a counterattack against the beachhead. The attack was a disaster. Within the first hour, 8 of his tanks had been destroyed by Sherman fire from ranges his own guns couldn't effectively engage. But what struck Yamada, as he watched from a concealed position after his own tank had been disabled, was what happened next. American recovery vehicles moved forward while the battle was still ongoing, hooking cables to damaged Shermans and dragging them back to the beach. Within 6 hours, 3 of the tanks that Yamada had personally seen disabled were back in action, their damaged tracks replaced, their mechanical problems repaired. By the next morning, the beach was crowded with newly landed tanks, dozens of them, fresh from the ships, their olive-drab paint unmarked by combat. Yamada counted 47 Sherman tanks in a single assembly area. His entire regiment had started the war with 38 tanks total. The American supply system wasn't just abundant, it was incomprehensible in its scale and efficiency. Japanese tanks that were damaged in combat typically stayed damaged. Spare parts had to be requisitioned through the bureaucratic supply system, shipped from Japan assuming they were available at all, and then installed by unit mechanics working with limited tools in field conditions. A thrown track might take a week to repair. A damaged transmission could mean the tank was out of action for months. Catastrophic damage meant the tank was abandoned and stripped for parts. American tanks were different. The Sherman's design incorporated ease of maintenance as a fundamental principle. The engine could be removed and replaced in a matter of hours using a specialized jig. The transmission was a single unit that could be swapped out without disassembling the entire hull. Track blocks were designed with replaceable rubber pads that could be changed quickly. The entire philosophy was different. Don't repair components in the field, replace them. Keep large inventories of spare parts at forward depots. Build standardized components that any mechanic can install. Treat tanks as machines to be serviced, rather than crafted objects to be maintained by specialists. This approach required enormous industrial capacity to support, but it meant that American armored units maintained operational readiness rates that Japanese commanders simply couldn't match. An American tank battalion might have 80% of its vehicles operational at any given time. A Japanese tank regiment was fortunate to have 50%. This disparity compounded over time. After 6 months of combat operations, an American armored division might still field 90% of its original strength through replacements and repairs. A Japanese tank regiment would be lucky to have 30%. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. The strategic implications of this industrial disparity became clear to Japanese commanders in late 1944. but by then it was far too late to do anything about it. General Tomoyuki Yamashita, commanding Japanese forces in the Philippines, received intelligence reports in November of 1944 that estimated American tank strength in the Pacific at over 4,000 vehicles. This number seemed impossible. It would have required the Americans to produce more tanks in 2 years than Japan had produced in a decade. Yamashita requested confirmation from Tokyo. The confirmation came back with revised numbers that made the situation even worse. The Americans didn't have 4,000 tanks in the Pacific theater. They had over 6,000, and they were still building 5,000 more every month. The psychological impact of this revelation on Japanese strategic planning cannot be overstated. The entire war plan for the Pacific had been predicated on the assumption that American industrial capacity, while large, could be offset by Japanese tactical excellence, defensive positioning, and the enormous logistical challenges of projecting power across the Pacific Ocean. The strategy was to make every island expensive, to destroy American equipment faster than it could be replaced, to create conditions where the cost of victory would be so high that the American public would demand a negotiated peace. This strategy required that American losses be unsustainable. It required that every destroyed tank, every sunk ship, every downed aircraft represent an irreplaceable loss that would gradually degrade American offensive capacity. The entire defensive doctrine that Japanese forces employed from Tarawa to Iwo Jima was built on this assumption. Make them pay in blood and steel, and eventually they'll run out of steel. But they weren't running out. They weren't even slowing down. The Americans were losing hundreds of tanks in the Pacific campaigns and replacing them all within weeks. They were losing thousands of aircraft and building thousands more. They were losing ships and launching new ones faster than Japan could sink them. The mathematics of attrition, the fundamental strategic calculation that Japanese planners had made in 1941, was completely wrong. Captain Nakamura learned the full truth about American production capacity in March of 1945 during his interrogation at the POW camp outside Manila. The American intelligence officer conducting the interrogation was a former automotive engineer from Detroit who had worked at the Chrysler tank arsenal before being commissioned. He showed Nakamura photographs of the factory floor vast assembly lines stretching for what seemed like kilometers, rows of partially completed tank hulls moving through the production sequence, overhead cranes lifting, completed turrets onto finished chassis. The officer explained the production process with obvious pride, how components were manufactured in hundreds of subcontractor facilities across the Midwest, how they were shipped to assembly plants on dedicated rail lines, how the final assembly took just 14 days from raw steel to finished tank. Nakamura asked the question that had been haunting him since Leyte: how many tanks had America built? The intelligence officer consulted his notes and provided a number: 49,000 Shermans, with production continuing at about 500 per month. The total, including all tank types, was approaching 90,000 vehicles. Nakamura did not believe him. It was impossible. No nation could build 90,000 tanks in 3 years. The officer must be exaggerating for propaganda purposes, inflating the numbers to demoralize prisoners. But then the officer showed him production statistics from the Chrysler arsenal alone: 557 tanks in January 1945, 543 in February, 529 in March. Month after month, year after year, one factory producing more tanks than all of Japan's industrial capacity combined. The officer explained that this was why the fighting had been so futile, why Japanese defensive positions had been overrun, despite inflicting heavy casualties on American forces. Every island Japan defended with tanks was facing an enemy that could afford to lose 10 tanks for every one they destroyed and still have more tanks the following week. The material advantage wasn't marginal, it was absolute. Nakamura asked about Japanese production numbers. The intelligence officer consulted another document and provided an estimate: approximately 6,400 tanks total across the entire war. Nakamura asked if this was a monthly figure. The officer shook his head. Total. 6,400 tanks for the entire war effort. 1/14 of American production. That evening, in the barracks at the POW camp, Nakamura tried to explain what he had learned to the other captured tank crew members. Most refused to believe it. They accused the Americans of psychological warfare, of fabricating numbers to break Japanese morale. One veteran sergeant insisted that the intelligence officer must have been including training vehicles and obsolete models in his count. Another argued that American production numbers were inflated by counting the same tanks multiple times as they were repaired and returned to service. But Nakamura had seen the evidence with his own eyes. He had watched an endless stream of fresh tanks rolling past his position on Leyte. He had seen supply depots that dwarfed anything Japan could field. He had witnessed American recovery vehicles towing damaged Shermans off the battlefield and returning them to combat within hours. The numbers weren't propaganda, they were reality, and they meant that everything Japanese military doctrine had assumed about fighting a war of attrition against the United States was catastrophically, fundamentally, impossibly wrong. The failure to accurately assess American industrial capacity had consequences that extended far beyond tank production. If the estimates about tanks were wrong by a factor of 14, what about aircraft? What about ships? What about ammunition, fuel, food, vehicles, spare parts, and all the other material requirements of modern warfare? The entire strategic framework that had led Japan to attack Pearl Harbor in 1941 had been built on faulty assumptions about American industrial potential, and by the time Japanese commanders realized the truth, it was far too late to change course. In the years following the war, historians and military analysts would study this intelligence failure as a case study in strategic miscalculation. How had an entire military establishment, with access to open-source information about American manufacturing capacity, gotten the numbers so catastrophically wrong? Part of the answer lay in cultural bias. Japanese military planners had assumed that American workers, accustomed to consumer goods and labor disputes, couldn't adapt to the discipline required for military production. They had underestimated American organizational capacity, assuming that coordinating production across hundreds of factories would result in chaos and inefficiency. But the deeper answer was that Japanese planners had failed to understand what modern industrial capitalism could accomplish when fully mobilized for war production. The American economy in 1941 was the largest in the world, with a gross domestic product approximately 7 times that of Japan. When that economic power was directed toward military manufacturing, supported by essentially unlimited raw materials from domestic sources and hemispheric trade, protected by ocean barriers from enemy attack, and driven by a population of 130 million people with high literacy rates and technical education, the result was productive capacity on a scale that defied pre-war predictions. The Sherman tank itself became a symbol of this industrial dominance. It wasn't the best tank of the war by most technical measures. German Panthers had better armor and more powerful guns. Soviet T-34s had better mobility and simpler maintenance. But the Sherman had one overwhelming advantage. There were tens of thousands of them. American armored divisions could afford to lose tanks in combat because replacement vehicles would arrive within days. American tank crews could afford to take risks because if their vehicle was knocked out, a new one would be waiting. American logistics officers could afford to leave damaged tanks behind because salvaging them wasn't worth the effort when fresh ones were constantly arriving from the production line. For Japanese tankers like Captain Nakamura, facing this industrial juggernaut meant fighting a war they could not win through tactics, courage, or skill. Every engagement was a mathematical inevitability. The Americans could lose and keep fighting. Japan could win battles and still lose the war. The disparity in production, 88,410 tanks versus 6,450, wasn't just a number. It was the difference between an industrial superpower and a regional military power pretending to be an empire. It was the mathematical expression of strategic delusion. Nakamura survived the war and returned to Japan in 1946. He never spoke publicly about his experiences as a tank commander, never gave interviews to historians, never wrote memoirs, but in private conversations with family members in later years, he would sometimes mention the moment in the POW camp when he learned the truth about American production capacity. It hadn't made him angry or ashamed. It had made him unutterably sad. All the sacrifice, all the deaths, all the destroyed machines and burning crews, it had all been in pursuit of a strategic objective that was impossible from the beginning. Japan had gone to war with a nation that could build tanks faster than Japan could train crews to operate them. The outcome had never been in doubt. The only variable had been how long it would take and how many people would die before the mathematical certainty of industrial superiority played out to its inevitable conclusion. The Japanese military had believed that spirit could overcome material, that tactical excellence could compensate for numerical inferiority, that defensive fortifications could offset productive capacity. They were wrong. In modern industrial warfare, production capacity is strategic capacity. A nation that can build 14 times as many tanks as its opponent will eventually win, regardless of tactical considerations. This was the lesson that Japanese commanders learned in the ashes of defeat, watching American Sherman tanks rolling through the streets of occupied cities in 1945. The war hadn't been lost in any single battle. It had been lost in the factories of Detroit, in the steel mills of Pittsburgh, in the organizational genius of American industrial managers who had turned the construction of armored fighting vehicles into an assembly line process that could produce a finished tank every 45 minutes, every day, for 3.5 years. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe.